Hello and welcome to So What, the podcast where we speak with experts about one thing that is profoundly and perhaps unexpectedly significant and that they will argue should matter to everyone. My name is Sean Johnson Andrews. I am Associate Professor Emeritus of Cultural Studies at Columbia College Chicago.
And I'm Madhurima Chakraborty, Associate Professor of Literature at Columbia College Chicago. And maybe we should talk a little bit about what this is, what our podcast is. It's our first episode, or it's episode 0, right, is what we're calling this.
Yes.
That's how many views we have.
Right now, but as soon as this goes online, they're just going to shoot right up.
Viral.
Yeah. My sense of this was that we often have generative, productive conversations that are mostly about the so what, and we wanted to share those.
Yeah, I think the humanities and liberal arts in particular are really having to answer that question. But I also think that to a lot of us from inside of the liberal arts, the stakes have never been clearer. So I thought it might be, it might be fun to talk to some people that we know and try and get them to convince us that this thing that they think is crucially important is actually, in fact, crucially important.
Yes. And by extension, the questions at the center of the humanities and social sciences continue to be essential to understanding how the world operates.
Yeah, exactly.
So you have a topic, a person that has come to your attention through some recent research.
Yeah. So one of the times that we were talking, I think in the last few months, I had spent the week thinking about this figure, Korla Pandit, who I don't know if you knew him or knew of him before we started talking, but he was just this mesmerizing figure. And we both felt that this was somebody that we could actually spend some time trying to think about through many different lenses.
Yeah. And I was doing research in the questions and struggles of fitting into these categories of identity. And by categories, I mean these socially constructed distinctions like race, gender, sexuality, and nationality, which we're told are absolutely concrete and empirical, but which ultimately prove very difficult to maintain, to police, to identify, and in this case, to perform authentically, right? So this was an example you came across showing how arbitrary this is and how performative it is that you thought I would also be interested in. So maybe we can start by you telling us who Korla Pandit was.
Okay, so Korla Pandit was this virtuoso pianist who had his own TV show. It was called Korla Pandit's Adventures in Music, and it was on KTLA, which is a TV station out of LA.
We bring you musical gems from near and far, blended into a pattern of glorious harmony. A program based on the universal language of music, it is our pleasure to present to you Korla Pandit.
It ran from 1948 to 1951, and it was a TV show that was on the air for 15 minutes every weekday. And we would hear him play music in this style. So later on, this style, I think, came to be known as Exotica. Off the show, he would often talk about his background. He was from India. He had an Indian father. He had a French mother. They had moved to the United States when he was a child. He went to the University of Chicago for college.
Born in New Delhi, India, and started performing music, in a sense, at a very early age, 2 years and 4 months old.
And on the show, he had this fascinating look. He had this turban with a big jewel on the turban. He would never talk on the show, not once in 900 episodes.
Jeez.
But he looked directly at the camera, and sometimes the camera would show these dancers in the background. Oh. And so the sounds and the visuals, they seriously leaned into all that Orientalist imagery that we would have expected from an Indian man in LA in the 1940s and 50s.
Sure.
And I'm saying 1940s and 50s, but he he continued performing that kind of music in that kind of garb for decades after. So he actually dies in 1998, but it's not until 2001 that we learn that he wasn't Indian at all, right? So Korla Pandit was born John Roland Redd. He was actually a light-skinned black man who was born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1921.
Wow.
And by the way, I'm going to continue to call him Korla Pandit, even though I am Indian. I actually, am from New Delhi. I know that the word Pandit is actually pronounced Pandit, right? But it's not real. Like,
Yes.
that it doesn't actually speak to a lineage that connects him in any way, shape, or form to any pundits. He was Korla Pandit, so.
Right.
And this was a persona that he had taken on. And when I say persona, it wasn't just like a stage personality. Like literally, he lived as Korla Pandit. His kids, his two sons, have the last name Pandit. This is who he was.
And didn't know any different until after he had died.
Yeah, the
as well.
kids. Absolutely.
So yeah, it's a striking story because he had to keep that ruse up for decades. I mean, we're talking 50 years or more that he had to basically perform this character on and off screen all the time.
Yeah. And, even calling it a performance, I don't know. I mean, okay, so of course, all identities are performed in that they're mediated through our bodies. But in the theatrical sense, so there's that 2001 article by R.J. Smith. I guess that's the article that definitively outs, Pandit as a black man. So in that, we get the sense that Korla Pandit's two sons had maybe heard rumors that he was actually this or that other ethnicity, but they absolutely insisted that their father and therefore their heritage was Indian,
And he didn't start out as a performer being Indian, right?
Right.
Which is also, I guess, a feature of the biography that's interesting.
I think so too. So Korla Pandit's born in 1921. And this man, who's John Roland Redd, moves to LA in the 1940s. And he's trying to make it as a musician. He's got some success, but because he's kept out of white spaces, he adopts the name Juan Rolando, which is Spanish for John Roland, and takes on that personality and says he's Mexican in order to be part of the union in spaces that are off limit for Black Americans, So he does this. And then the story is that he meets his wife, who is a white woman. So they go to Mexico to get married because, of course, again, you can't be married to a white woman if you're a black man. And when they come back to LA is when they've sort of built this personality of a Korla Pandit that he adopts.
And part of what led you to looking at this was because part of what makes this possible is the sort of vacuum of Indian representation in the United States at this moment.
Yeah, absolutely. The work that I'm doing, the research that I'm doing is actually on South Asian comedians and South Asians in comedy in the United States, right? But you'll remember, you were there. I got sucked for a while. I got sucked into, and I still think it's incredibly interesting to try and find out what the history of representation of Indians in visual culture were. There aren't a lot of South Asians in movies and in TV because it's illegal. Like literally, the immigration laws of the time don't allow for South Asians to be here, and definitely not be here in the kinds of numbers that would allow for a critical mass, that would allow for some sort of response, that would allow for some insistence on accurate storytelling, and that just does not exist. So between 1917 and 1946, it is actually illegal for South Asians to move to the United States. They're straight up prohibited from moving to the United States. And that's the Immigration Act in 1917, which is an extension of the Chinese Exclusion Act from the late 1880s, which barred East Asians from moving to the United States. And so it's this expanding, restrictive legal determination of who is allowed to be here and who belongs here. And in 1946, some of that starts to relax very teeny tiny bit for Indians and Filipinos. Some of the legal restrictions ease up, but only to the tune of 100 visas a year for Indians and Filipinos.
Sure.
At the time that this is a massively popular but local show on TV, there are maybe a couple of thousand people of South Asian descent in the entire United States. It's a small, tiny number. So I think that's exactly what allows for this kind of representation.
Well, I mean, I think that to go back to even some of the earlier legislation and in this sort of struggle over, there's a Supreme Court case, the United States versus Thind in 1923, which comes right after another case called Tozawa versus United States, involving a Japanese man. And in each of these cases, the United States basically has a rule about the naturalization of what it calls, quote, free white persons, right? And so there's this category of whiteness that then becomes a site of struggle over who gets to be defined that way. Both of these, a Japanese man and then a man who we would classify as being South Asian, both then claim, well, we're white.
Yeah,
right?
there's there's an aggressive claim to whiteness. And by the way, both of them are denied on the basis that they are in fact not white, right?
Sure.
And if you read the rulings of these cases, it's not even, I mean, they're pretty much just saying, listen, we all know who's white and you're not it, and you may say that you're part of this or that ancestry, but we know what white means. And you are absolutely not it. So there's this contested space where trying to get political power, trying to get social power means trying to access whiteness. And that shapes the entire discourse of who belongs to the United States for a really, really long time.
And that also goes all the way back to Plessy versus Ferguson, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, this is one of the sort of interesting things that Kimberlé Crenshaw talks about in her Mapping the Margins piece, which is that there were two different arguments in Plessy versus Ferguson. This is the Supreme Court case that decides what becomes separate but equal. Mm-hmm. And Plessy was a very light-skinned black man who basically staged his arrest on a Louisiana train. Right? He got everybody involved because there wouldn't have been any other way for people to know that he was black, effectively, right? He appeared to be white. And part of the case eventually was decided on whether you can have separate but equal. But his first point was like, you can't even tell. Like the category of whiteness means nothing. The category of black means nothing. And so that's an interesting front on that kind of racial struggle that basically the Supreme Court at that point was just like, well, we're not going to litigate this. We all know what whiteness is, but they don't.
But we really don't. I think it's especially easy for us as non-Black people to talk about the absurdity of racial categories, because I think when you actually have to deal with the very real consequences of what it means to be Black in America, then the intellectual paucity of race kind of bleeds into the background of significance,
That's absolutely true. And this speaks to something that Crenshaw also says in that article, which is that the best strategy of resistance is to occupy and defend these categories rather than questioning the arbitrariness of their constitution.
Right.
So the possibility of passing highlights this arbitrariness, but as a person who hasn't faced the life or death consequences of not passing, I'm definitely in no place to lean into that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, me either. Though, though the thing that you're saying about the arbitrariness of racial categories, I mean, that has quite a bit of political heft, in addition to the intellectual questions it raises. There's absolutely a history of non-white people in this country finding refuge or cover among other communities in order to escape violent racism. So, some Black freedom seekers escaping enslavement are said to have found protection among Native communities who adopted them as their own. Or in the case of South Asians, during this time of restrictive immigration, including that Supreme Court case that you were talking about, South Asians, especially those from what we would now call Bangladesh, they arrived in the States and they found a home and family in non-white communities, such as Harlem or Treme in New Orleans. So to me, the whole situation with Korla Pandit can also be seen as an extension of that practice of establishing affinities that come out of dire and racist circumstances. But I have to be clear that he's only allowed to participate within a very specific and narrow cultural vocabulary. He can only talk about and promote elements of exoticism, of all of these Orientalist tropes that combine silence with mysticism, that is very limited in scope and actually has no substantive references. Like, they don't refer back to something real in the real world. They are simulacra and circulate widely because, in fact, they are empty of that political significance.
Well, and there's no referent. There's no one to sort of push back on the referent there. And I think one of the things that you mentioned, which is also, I think, an important part of just imagining what that was like for him, is the sort of exile.
Yes.
From his actual community, from his actual family. That's a sort of element of anyone who has to pass, especially professionally.
I mean, there are consequences, right? There are stories about Korla Pandit, like sneaking back to see his family, his Black family, and leaving within a day. And he was one of 6 siblings, so his siblings, his nephews, nieces, they could come to shows, but there would be no immediate or automatic interaction. His father moves close to him to California, and he doesn't just get to go hang out with his dad, like that's not a thing that happens. And instead, he trades that, but again, not for participating in a real lineage of cultural and aesthetic practices. He has this song called Song of India, which even the showrunners indicate nobody in India would know the song, right? It's not authentic, but it is real in that it starts this whole movement called Exotica in music, which again, I would love to actually hear from a musicologist about to actually unpack what all of this means. But in my understanding, this music that reaches its heyday in the late 1950s, early 1960s is about catering to a nostalgia that World War II veterans face when they come back to the United States, like having traveled to, to the Far East and to Asia or even to Hawaii to bring back these elements of the exotic. And that's why you sort of have tiki bars
in LA.
In
especially.
LA. Yeah. And it's part of all of these things that have no bearing on the complex lived realities, but they do provide the most easily consumable set of cultural codes, which are recognizable to wide audiences because they are uncomplicated.
Sure.
Because they're part of this sort of generalizing, emptying process.
Yeah, it would be interesting to talk to a musicologist about how do you trace Korla Pandit to Ravi Shankar and then the Beatles, like what's the what's the sort of lineage there? How do those all kind of fit together? Do they? Because we're not talking about actual cultural authenticity, but that simulacra there's some flow there.
Yeah, I mean,
interesting.
So like descriptions of Exotica, and again, welcome musicologists to call me on this if I'm getting it incorrect, but sometimes it's been described as just like, Western standards that have like a different set of chords to them every now and then to introduce what sounds like it could be an
Sure.
Eastern Asian element.
Mhm.
And I mean, and we're sort of joking about the absurdity of all of this, but I think it's also true that there's an irony that the journalist R.J. Smith points out. Here's this man who's born in this place in this time where Black men are lynched for transgressing their place in society, and he ends up being this figure on TV who is deeply, deeply powerful among his white female audiences who stare back at him. And because he doesn't present as Black, because he's taken on this other, empty, inauthentic, but other persona, which makes it like okay.
Yeah.
Which makes it okay. As long as he doesn't speak. That is a thing that I find fascinating, is that in all 900 episodes, he does not speak.
Yeah. But evidently in his interactions with people off screen, they couldn't get him to shut up.
Yeah, right.
Is what they say.
That's the joke. Yeah.
Yeah. So what else do you think we should know? Or what else is sort of interesting to you about Korla Pandit if we were going to wrap up?
Well, okay, so this is completely frivolous. I think that it would be fun to know how many people in his circle actually knew at his time, because obviously his kids didn't know. I understand that maybe the studio did know. One of his friends was Sabu Dastagir, who is maybe the only actual Indian American actor who was born in India and was in Hollywood productions playing Indian characters, who was one of his friends. So it would be kind of fun to find out like how many people were in the know and understanding the theater that had to be played. What about you? You have something?
What interests me about it, what sort of struck me, was just that these categories are always performative. And the fact that someone could live in this way and appear and be kind of accepted as authentically Indian, even if that is mostly fulfilling a set of stereotypes. Yeah, I think it does sort of highlight how just how constructed those categories are to begin with. In the same way that Plessy could have passed and just ridden in that railroad car. And no one would have been the wiser.
Right.
But wanted to say, no, that there is something at stake here for other people of color who are riding in that railroad car. But otherwise, it's totally constructed. And so I think that's part of what kind of interests me about that.
So it'll be fun if we can get more people to come talk to us about the constructedness of race.
And gender. That was kind of my entry point into thinking about this performativity. It was just that's also something that we don't necessarily know what is going on, but we want to secure that in some way, right? That these bathroom bills and things like that. Not me and you, not you and I.
Yeah, you and I are not invested in that.
No, but the idea that you could make that completely transparent, and
or that transparency is owed.
Yes.
To somebody else,
Exactly. And that somehow that transparency makes anyone safer or anyone more secure or whatever. That seems to be another theme that kind of runs through all of this.
Yeah.
Right? Knowing who's Black is somehow going to keep white people safe.
Right. I mean, and that's the thing, right? Like that actually what we're keeping safe, and this is something that I've learned from listening to you of the last few months, is that, what we're actually keeping safe is the structure. Nobody who claims that their safety is at stake, they're not in actual peril. What is in peril is the discourse. What is in peril are like power hierarchies, and that is the safety that you're actually invested in.
Yes. And that's why right now we have ICE agents amassing on the borders of Chicago to come and disrupt what is a normally everyday pretty safe environment.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well,
Okay.
thanks for joining us today, everyone, and especially you, Madhurima.
Well, thanks for doing this podcast with me. I'm excited. I think we're going to have some interesting guests lined up, and we're looking forward to a season of some great conversations with some of our favorite experts who will be talking to us about everything from like employment numbers to fragrances.
And we'll even talk to a few kids about what they think is cool. Well, thanks for joining us. We have been talking today about Korla Pandit and the constructedness of racial identities and the politics of performance. I'm Sean, and you can find my other writing at breakingculture.substack.com.
And I'm Madhurima. You can find out more about my work at madhurimachakraborty.net. The music for our show was composed for us by Chris Stokes. You've been listening to the podcast, So What?